This episode of Tales from the Backlog is brought to you by the wonderful patrons of the Tube Podcast Network. Some personal heroes of mine like Chris Nelson, the Top 3 Podcast crew, Zulgeek, Eric Guess, Rick Firestone, Nick Ficori, Jill, Soccer, ZNA, Cupcake, Kyle, Christian S., Matt aka Stormageddon, JD, Doug Leaf, Jason Emery, Rob Shack, Brian Skirsha, Randall, Jake Martin, Jenny E., and many more have all chosen to support the show by going to patreon.com/realdavejackson and kicking a few bucks a month my way. And in return, they're getting some bonus goodies like bonus episodes of the show, voting on what games I cover on the show, and much more. If that sounds interesting to you, once again, that's patreon.com/realdavejackson. Any and all support is always appreciated. And with that being said, let's get on to the show. Hello, everybody. My name is Dave Jackson, and you're listening to Tales from the Backlog. This is a video games review podcast where each week I'm joined by a guest to bring a game out of the backlog, play it, and discuss. We have a special episode today because we're not talking about one game. We're going to talk about many games today, about games that are set in cool, real-world places. But before we get into that, I have two wonderful guests with me today. They are both friends of the show, first-time guests on the show, cultural gaming connoisseurs. Randall Quiggle, welcome.
Yo.
Man of few words. I love it. Well, I would say I love it, but this is a podcast. You got to talk a little bit.
We got to have words, Randall.
We're also joined today by Ozzy Garcia. Ozzy, welcome.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for having me. I'm glad to now be part of the Tales from the Backlog lore. I am now part of the culture of Tales from the Backlog, so thank you for integrating me and for being so considerate of presentation.
Of course.
Of other retired podcasters.
Right, yeah. Retired from the Region Free Gamers podcast. And people will have heard Ozzy and Randall on the Retro Hangover podcast several times. If you are fans of that show, which you should be, and I have a feeling we'll talk about Retro Hangover a little bit later in the show. Just a little tease. Today, we are going to talk about games that are set in real places. But in order to narrow this down and really drill into the reason I wanted to talk about this, we're going to talk about games set in the real world or kind of, slightly dramatized versions of real places. But we are excluding really common video game settings like the United States and Western Europe and Japan. So as much as I want to spend the next hour talking about Yakuza games, not today. Sorry. We have many hours on the podcast already talking about Yakuza. So I wanted to kind of focus on games that are set in other places around the world, maybe even historical real world settings, and specifically games that kind of give you a window into some aspects of that culture or their history or any combination of those things, where you might even learn something. How about that? So as much as I, love the Hitman series, to give another example, when I play Hitman and you do the level in Romania in Hitman 3, I don't learn anything about Romanian culture by doing that. That level's on a train, or like there's a level in China in Hitman 3, but I don't really learn much about China. I'm just, I'm choking people out. I'm taking their clothes. That's what you do. So we want to drill into games that are kind of highlighting culture and history as, one of the main things of those games. So I will get us started early on with the kind of game I played recently that inspired this topic, which is Detention by Red Candle Games. Have you guys played Detention before?
I have not. The little I know about it is that they're made from the team that made Devotion, and
right.
Devotion was banned in China, and it ended up being subsequently banned in all the other major storefronts like Steam and Epic Game Stores, etc. So that's what I know. I know it's a horror title. I know it's first person. So I was really curious when I saw it here, and I said, that piques my interest. Yeah. So looking forward to hearing.
And pretty much the same deal. was turned like it. I know Detention from Devotion mostly because of the whole storefront controversy and whatnot. And the moment that I heard that Red Candle Games essentially just said, F you to the CCP whenever they just made, it was like an off-color joke or whatever in their game. And then it got taken down. I was like, looks like I need to go play this game. And then Chris from the Retro Hangover podcast actually streamed playing it, and that was how I got introduced to it. And I was like, oh, not only is this game good, but these guys are completely within their right, like with defending their game. So I was like, and I learned a lot just from it's not that long of a game as well.
Yeah, I have not played Devotion. I have it listed on here because Detention and Devotion are both set in Taiwan. That's where this dev studio is from. They're from Taiwan. Detention is a third-person point-and-click set in the 1960s when Taiwan was under martial law in their own history. Devotion is set in the 1980s in Taipei, which is the capital. The reason I kind of latched onto this, a couple of reasons. Number one, I've traveled to Taiwan a couple of times back when I lived in Asia. I really loved traveling there. I did some couch surfing there, stayed with some local people, had a great time. And then playing Detention especially, and I know what happens in Devotion because at one point I was convinced I'd never play it, so I spoiled the story for myself. It's cool, and it's a very specific cultural thing again, and I don't want to talk too much about it because it gets into spoilers, and also I haven't played it, but Detention is set during this martial law period in Taiwan, and the fact that they're living under martial law with censorship and heavy propaganda and all of that, and punishment for speaking out against the government, stuff like that, really felt like it was a unique window into their history. And it's a horror game, so they use that to effect within the horror genre. But this was the game that I played, and I thought, this is really cool how, this indie studio has made a game about their own culture, their own history, tied it into the horror genre, set it out into the world, and now people like me can play this game and just get a glimpse of that. And I think that that's really valuable, especially I think it's valuable for everybody to learn a little bit of stuff like that through the media that you consume. And so many of our games are set in the United States or Japan or Western Europe or completely fictional places, right? So you don't get windows into cultures that you're not familiar with very often. So yeah, Detention was the first game I wanted to kind of bring up here as the kind of shining example for this podcast.
And I think the most I think promising aspect of this entire episode is that I feel like games have a unique ability to really transport you into a particular time and place. And if done right, it really does feel like you can taste what it felt like to be in that particular point in time. For example, I know we're not talking about Japan, but when you look at the My Summer Adventure games, that transports you to being a child in the 1970s in the Japanese countryside and being there for the summer. And it gives you the sights and sounds that something like a movie would not really be able to achieve in full extent because it's a 2D plane. I mean, notwithstanding the possibility of having 3D glasses or something. But you can't really say, there's a house there or there's a person there, let me go to them, or let me go to this side of the town, or let me check this out and maybe read a log or something that gives you some more flavor. I think the very best examples of the games that, manage to convey this cultural slice of life, to say it that way, it's one, they're authentic. They're authentic in that they're being told most likely by either someone that knows that culture quite well or that respects that culture quite well. I don't think that it is necessary to be from that culture to tell that story. I don't believe that cultural appropriation is really an issue, in all cases necessarily. But what I do want to see is stories that are told well in a way that respects their origin. And the ability to really say, hey, you're going to be transported to this very specific time and place in Taiwan in the 1960s. I don't know if there are many other pieces of media that can achieve that, to be honest. And then you add the layer of potential even virtual reality in the future, and really it's just boundless possibilities that could arise from managing to mine all the different cultures, because there's so many different, materials that you can mine from so many different cultures, that to me, it almost feels a little bit short-sighted to keep focusing on the same few Western cultures and tropes. Because it's like, if you're struggling for creativity, dude, just go out and find, a local, culture, and you're going to get something really cool and interesting, because every culture has its own mythology. And I don't mean in the gods and heroes kind of sense, in the sense of they have their own folklore. And honestly, I wish that more games did this. And what I realized in researching for this episode is that, incredibly enough, finding the games to talk about is harder than you would think it is.
Yep.
Because most games are either Western in style, Western derived, or they may have some sort of influence, but it's very tangential. So it's really, to me, it's kind of a missed opportunity.
Yeah. Go ahead, Randall.
Oh, yeah, sorry. No, I was just going to build off the point of the westernization of most things, because, 90% of fantasy is built off of, like the foundation laid by Tolkien, which was a very westernized version of fantasy that he wrote while, fighting in World War II. It's it's very interesting that even whenever you go completely fantastical with, humans, elves, and dwarves, that still has deep ties to at least Western, Europe sensibilities and cultures.
Yeah, same with sci-fi. And, if you go, based on that through line, it's almost like if every fantasy or high fantasy setting takes place in the English countryside. So the bucolic, English countryside of Tolkien's, past. But you do see that influence, that a Western influence, really seeps through even to settings that are not realistic in nature. And that was kind of disheartening to see.
Yeah, I think that, like, one of the things that I think is going to come up with the examples that we talk about today is that indie games, again, are like the bastion for this type of representation of different places and cultures. Just like indie games are often a bastion for new creative ideas in the gaming industry. And the fact that making video games has become more accessible over the years means that more and more people, no matter where they're from, are starting to gain the ability to make games with polish about the places that they have experienced. And I think that that's going to come up a lot with other games that we talk about today. And of course, we'll have some AAA level games in here too. But I do think that we're going to have some real indies stick out here, which is exciting. So I will kick it over to you, Randall. What is one game that you brought for this conversation here?
Yeah, so I guess we'll just immediately swing into, I guess it would be considered a double A title if people still use that term nowadays to describe like semi-published works. Anyways, the example that I brought first was the Stalker series, like the first 3 games, but mostly Shadow of Chernobyl, because that's the one that most people know, and the one that tends to have the most cultural significance, at least. Skies, I think it's Skies Over Pripyat is another good one. Or is it Clear Skies? I can't remember the title right now. But anyways, the main Stalker game, Shadows of Chernobyl, the main reason I wanted to bring that one is just how deeply Eastern European that game is. Like, from the main language that's spoken, like you have to deliberately change the language to English. And most of the time, it's a bad idea to do so because they didn't, if I remember correctly, they only had like 1 or 2 voice actors record English lines. Everything else was recorded in Russian or Ukrainian. And the main crux of the whole thing, for people who, I don't know how you wouldn't know, but just in case you don't, Stalker is a first-person survival shooter game taking in taking place in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So right in what would it be, like cardinal direction wise in Ukraine? It's like the north.
But
Somebody
it's
help me.
not a geography podcast, so I think you're good, Randy.
It's whatever. You get my point. But to bring some examples of like the kind of things that just playing the game very much introduces most people to was, again, it's mostly spoken in Russian or Ukrainian. All of the architecture is like Soviet era or post-Soviet era architecture, and a lot of the architecture is broken down military bases, kind of showing the Russian influence in Ukrainian territory at the time. All of the monsters in those games are built off of Ukrainian folklore and myths. Ooh. So the things created from the anomalies are all built off of actual myths and legends that Ukrainians came up with because they could not enter the exclusion zone. So they would be like, oh, someone's dog got lost and it came back this hideous beast type deal. And then one of my favorite parts about that game is there isn't a lot of music in it, but when there is music, it's all based off of the classical acoustic, like Slavic, like tones. And so it's, while it's not, it's not reading you a history book of Ukrainian and Soviet history, it is just a bleeding that that whole culture. I could go into a diatribe about the fact that the whole game is based off of a book published in the 70s called Roadside Picnic. Long story short with that one is that book shouldn't have been published in the 70s based on how it was written. The entire context of the book was about Soviet censorship for even fictional writings, because Roadside Picnic is a science fiction novel, and it was incredibly difficult for Arkady and Boris. I cannot remember how to pronounce their last name. It was a brother like duo to publish it. It took them years to get it published, but they were actually able to do it. And it was an incredible feat to be able to publish that science fiction work back in those times. And then it was developed into Stalker. So again, that Soviet era criticism of the government and censorship kind of bleeds into the game as well. But that's my biggest example.
And Randall, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that, because before Stalker, the video game gets its name from Stalker, the movie, which was made by Andrei Tarkovsky, probably the greatest Soviet director of all time. And the interesting, not funny thing about Andrei Tarkovsky is that his films were so controversial that it is generally understood that he was poisoned by the Soviet government. Him and his family. So him and his family died, over time from cancer. And they said that it was a slow poisoning. So it's very relevant that this piece of media, in large part, took so much pain, literally, and sacrifice in order to be able to be brought, to readers and to viewers. So it's very interesting. And one of the things that I will say is that I don't see Soviet era Cold War material being mined enough. And yes, we do see Cold War spy films and media and the James Bond mold, etc. But really, Soviet era paranoia, it's not really used a lot. There is, a lot of stories that could be told about, East Germany. There's a lot of stories about being under the Soviet bloc. There's stories about the war in Afghanistan, with the Soviets, etc. There's so many areas of Soviet, history that is just not being used nowadays. And like I said, I mean, it's a very interesting piece because it was kind of the diametrical opposite of what was considered Western. And it was an alternative to kind of the Western approach to things. And, me having grown up in Cuba under, a kind of Soviet influence, my cartoons growing up were Soviet cartoons. I I grew up watching Soviet movies, etc., and under Soviet architecture in many ways. It's almost nostalgic to me, and it's really, to me, a shame that I don't see more of that. Recently, we saw it in that very controversial game, Atomic Hearts, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
That was really mining a lot of the Soviet era tropes, but in a very sci-fi, Bioshocky way. But I think there's a story to be told about the experience of living under Soviet espionage and paranoia, during that Cold War period that begs to be told.
Yeah, I think a lot of the media, like with that kind of flavor that I was exposed to, is mostly, like you said, like the James Bond, like you've got your villains that are like the Russians and stuff like that. But it seems like people have moved on, and the only thing I can think of in recent years is that show Chernobyl from HBO, which was excellent, like one of the best little miniseries I've ever seen.
And the Americans,
terrifying.
to some extent, even the Americans, even though that took place in the United States, it was about a Soviet, family living as spies here.
But this game Stalker it's another example of this development team is Ukrainian, so they're pulling from their own culture. They're pulling, I don't know where these people grew up, but like I find it hard to believe you could not grow up under the shadow of this, like, disaster that happened in your home country. Especially, it's interesting to think, like, as an American, like our country is so fucking big that like something like this could happen, and it's almost like a lifetime away. But not saying Ukraine is small, but it is, relatively small from my perspective. So people growing up under the shadow of this kind of, it's been hanging over everything that they, hanging over their lives is what I'm trying to say. And so this game, I always wondered, like, how real world was it? Like how far over the line into like sci-fi horror or whatever did it cross? But it sounds like, you're fighting monsters and stuff like that, but it sounds like the more grounded stuff is pretty real world.
Well, and I will say, when you see the trailer to Stalker 2, one of the things I really was intrigued by is that it does keep that kind of very Slavic flavor. I think it's stuck in development hell now, but I would really love to see it. I think it's coming to Game Pass or like whenever it's released. But the thing that scared me away from Stalker was that, from what I understood, the mechanics were very obtuse. It's a very hard game. And so I kind of shied away from it, but, kind of hearing Randall talk about it now, it just feels like that's something I should get over and just try to play it.
The game in itself, while you can make it easier for yourself, it's actually, I think it's a pretty accessible game. It just appears to be difficult. And it's kind of by design that way, because the game also really tries to hammer home the absolute resilience of the Ukrainian people to even live through a situation like this, where the exclusion zone has now turned into, okay, so we're still under, Soviet, the Soviet shadow. How are we going to take this situation and make the best out of it? So there are people that go out into the zone, which is what it's called, and acquire artifacts based in, pure science fiction that, and I think it was either Ozzy or Dave that mentioned what was it? My brain is escaping me right now. It had to deal with the paranoia. There we go. Like a lot of the objects that they collect are based in Soviet history of paranoia. Like the Americans have this like fantastical ability to spy on all of their people, and they talk about that kind of stuff in the game as well, where the Russians are just as terrified of the zone as they are of the Americans, and just how the people deal with both situations at once.
Cool. So we've got Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl. Yeah, Shadow Shadow of Chernobyl. Okay.
Shadows over Chernobyl.
A
romantic saga taking place in Ukraine.
I was like, that doesn't sound right, like the right tone. Yeah, Shadow of Chernobyl. All right. Ozzy, what did you bring for this?
Well, I kind of grouped it into different categories because, again, as I said, I found it a little bit difficult to just really find games that really did this in a very meaningful way. But the first category that I kind of looked at was just stories derived from, in a way, Native American culture. And when I say American, I don't mean necessarily United States, but just American in the sense of America as a whole. Even though I'll talk about Latin America separately. But the first one that I saw and that came to mind, I think it's probably the best example of really being able to communicate cultural heritage in a meaningful way. And that's a game called Never Alone, or Kisima in Yechuna, which translates in the Inupiaq language, which is the native Alaskans, to I Am Not Alone. And this is a game that came out in 2014, and it's very much in the limbo kind of mold where it's a puzzle platformer.
Okay.
And you play a native girl, Inupiaq girl called Nuna, and she's, accompanied by her fox. And you basically go through this land, this very snowy winter landscape of Alaska, and you see stories and you learn stories of the indigenous people. But what I find fascinating about this particular game is that it was created in collaboration with the Inupiaq people, and you actually unlock developer documentaries interviewing the Inupiaq people and telling them, the elders telling their stories, that relate to what you're playing. And literally, you unlock, these are the unlockables. So I think this is the very best form of unlockables. It's just like, okay, this was our influence. Here are the people that we consulted in order to tell you about the stories. So it's based on this, cultural folkloric tale that was told by Robert Nasrud Cleveland. It's a collection of stories called The Stories of the Black River People. And really, this is what the game is. And the sad part is that the developers were actually funded, by the Inupiaq people and the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. And this is the only game they ever made. So I feel like the game didn't do well enough, unfortunately. But this is probably about the best example of trying to manifest or bring to a greater audience the stories of native people that it's just not frequently told at all. So it's a short game. It's going for cheap. You may even have it because it's been part of a bunch of Humble Bundle deals. I understand that a sequel was announced maybe a year ago, but it hasn't been released. But I think it's one of the best examples of, being able to tell the stories that are at risk of disappearing because there are just not enough people, telling them. And that's really something that fascinates me, because really stories, culture, heritage is only as good as memory holds. But if you put it down either in writing, or better yet, put it down into a video game in which you can actually connect with younger generations and an even broader audience, because you don't have the language barrier, I think you could really make the stories kind of immortal in a way. And so I think this is one of the best examples of this particular situation and this particular kind of docu-style game approach, where it's still fun, it's still a puzzle platformer, but oh, by the way, you're really getting to absorb yourself in this native, and folkloric culture. So that's kind of the first one that I wanted to just kind of chat about.
Yeah, that's real cool. Like the fact that they, consulted the people who know the stories the best. And then it sounds like it like walks the line between like edutainment and like video games about, cultures and history and stuff, but more on the video game side. It just happens to be that like the story in this game is these, these folk tales and history and stuff like that. As opposed to like, I'm picturing, an edutainment where it's like, you're going to
learn, boy.
Yeah. You're going to learn. And this is technically a video game, but the reason you're here is to learn. With this sounds like a perfect game for this topic here. This is a culture and a history that I would bet most people listening to this, myself included, know absolutely nothing about. And like you said, the fact that they're able to make a video game and put it out there, I feel like, it's tough to get a game out there for tons and tons of people to play and buy. And like you said, I'm looking at the reviews, it got pretty middling reviews, didn't, if it's the only thing they ever made, then maybe it didn't sell well, like you said. But I think making video games is like a unique way for people to get these types of stories out there, as opposed to like, how difficult would it be for these same creators to make a movie and like mass produce a movie about this type of thing? I feel like, making video games is really fucking hard, and it's an accomplishment anytime anyone finishes a video game and sends it out to people. But that gives you like a unique opportunity to spread it like further than I think a movie or something like that, or a book would reach a lot of people. So this is cool. I like this.
Well, and you say middling reviews, but I think if anything, it was probably divisive in a way, because, Eurogamer gave it a 10 out of 10.
Yeah.
Others gave it an 8. When I looked at some of the YouTube reviews on that, they were all very positive. So I feel like, just reading between the lines, this might have been a game that came out at the wrong place, wrong time, and reviewers being reviewers, they were looking for something more gamey, perhaps, or something that was more innovative. Whereas I feel like if you just look at it as, hey, I am going to immerse myself into this experience that I am not at all familiar with,
right,
then you might come away thinking, wow, this was really fucking cool. So that's kind of where it seems like I land. So it's a quick 2 to 3 hour game. So it's, if anything, worth playing just to learn something new.
Yeah. And just to give a little bit of context on the reviews, the parts that you're trying to highlight here, showcasing this culture and history and the documentary style videos and stuff, that's the stuff that everyone seems to love about the game. And then the gameplay is a little bit more divisive, as these, like you said, Limbo and Inside style games, gameplay is pretty hit and miss in a lot of those types of games. But it seems like the most important part about this, they got that right.
Yeah. And just two quick hits on Native Americans. There's one called When Rivers Were Trails. It's free on itch.io, and it takes place in the 1890s in the Trail of Tears. So it's very similar to what was the game where the water tastes like wine? Which I wasn't a huge fan of. I thought that it was a very flawed game, but I did like some of the stories that it told. But this is basically, again, a game talking about indigenous culture, Native American cultures, and it brings in, those Native American writers to tell those stories. So one, it has a pretty cool art style, and two, it's actually using the stories from this very, authentic, source. So I find that to be very helpful. And the other one that I just kind of wanted to put out there just as a cameo of sorts is Prey from 2006.
Right.
Mind you, this is a sci-fi game, but I loved that game had a Native American protagonist. And it's a shame that we never saw a sequel in that line, because one of the things that I love about that game is that it starts out on an Indian reservation, and your main character is just fed up with being on this reservation, and it just kind of, for a time when that wasn't seen enough, to be placed right there in a reservation where that just wasn't, put out there, I found that to be very cool. Of course, it then ended up being something completely out of this world, quite literally, but I like the fact that it started out from that very unusual spot.
Yeah.
And I hope that someone else tells that story.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a shame that game's one of those that people who played it remember it fondly for stuff like that. And then for people like me, all I know about it is that, they made Arcane made Prey in 2017, and they were mandated to name the game Prey as a spiritual successor or some shit to that game against their wishes. That's really all I know about that game, which is a shame.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not a very good game. I find that the game really was hurt by the fact that it was in development hell for so long. The developer at the time was just not going through very easy times. And it was just kind of salvaged together, almost like a Duke Nukem Forever type of situation. But it does have some cool ideas, and again, I mean, it has this very, very interesting character. Gameplay itself, I mean, it has, like I said, some very cool ideas, but it doesn't really come together at the end. But it's worth applauding that it was doing this way before anyone else was doing it.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, which of my remaining games, I feel like I kind of took some of the easy ones up at the top of the list because I made the doc before I sent it to you guys. But let's I haven't talked about Sleeping Dogs on this podcast before. Let's talk about Sleeping Dogs.
Let's talk about Sleeping Dogs. The whole reason why I'm here.
Legit one of the best GTA style games ever fucking made.
Exactly. Yeah. This was made by United Front Games, and it's set in contemporary Hong Kong. And Randall kind of gave the pitch. It's GTA in Hong Kong. That's basically what the game is. But crucially, not set in an American city, not set in New York or Miami or something like that. And I liked the story in Sleeping Dogs way more than I've ever liked a GTA story. The story and tone I felt is way more my speed in Sleeping Dogs, and it takes advantage of the Hong Kong setting to tell its story too. I've been to Hong Kong several times traveling. I have some good friends that live in Hong Kong still. It's a cool place, and it has a really interesting history. And I think that the history of British colonialism and Chinese influence all mashed together makes for like a very interesting culture there. And you can see it when you visit Hong Kong, and you can see it in Sleeping Dogs, despite the fact that this is a mafia crime drama story. So it's not like a realistic story of like the everyday people in Hong Kong, but that kind of influence, the British influence on Hong Kong, is on full display. The foreign influence on Hong Kong is in full display in the story of Sleeping Dogs. So just to like give the reason why it still fits in this category, despite being kind of a ridiculous story, the setting is really fucking cool. And it's one of those games. It's a cool feeling to play a game set in a place realistically recreated version of a place that you've been in real life and that you are familiar with. And I got that while playing Sleeping Dogs, and it rocks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Randall.
I was just going to say my favorite part about the entirety of Sleeping Dogs is I really love mafia movies. I love mafia games. The Mafia series itself, it's an amazing set of games. And when I played Sleeping Dogs in it, one of my favorite things in this type of history was seeing how they portrayed the Chinese mafia in that game. From what I remember, it's incredibly interesting to see the parallels between the two types of groups, even though they would have never interacted with each other, because they like the mafia that most people know versus the mafia that is portrayed in that game. I guess you could call it something else, but that's the descriptor I'll use. It you're like, huh, there is what it feels like to be Western influence and something that would have never been influenced by Western sensibilities or culture.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the distinction as well is that, you could have a game set in Hong Kong that would still feel inauthentic. I think where the game went above and beyond was that it really tried to replicate not only the city itself, but kind of the little details here and there that make this city tick in a way. First of all, I mean, they speak, in Cantonese from time to time. So they go from English to Cantonese, and they say swear words in Cantonese. And I have not seen that in many games where they feel so comfortable just going outside of English. And granted, I mean, of course, English makes sense to be spoken here because the English presence was so strong in Hong Kong for so many years. But you can see the melting pot of, yeah, we have an English presence, but we're still Asian in this particular way. I'm not going to say any particular nationality other than Hong Kong. And so you see that. You also see, for example, the emphasis on karaoke, where you can actually go and do karaoke, where it's a minigame, but this is something that's important to these people. I mean, this is the way that they kind of, have this communal activity, and it's through karaoke. And I think the most interesting part to me about Sleeping Dogs, it's kind of a ripoff of Infernal Affairs, that very awesome trilogy of films, of Hong Kong films with Andy Lau, and I forgot the other actor's name. Terrific. If you haven't seen it, they're the films that The Departed was based on. So The Departed was a remake of Infernal Affairs 1. So basically a ripoff. You have this American cop that infiltrates the triads in Hong Kong. But the awesome part about this is that it's not only a recreation of Hong Kong culture, but in particular, it's a recreation of the immigrant experience. Because me as an immigrant, I came here when I was 10 to the United States. It really speaks to the fact that Wei is a Hong Kong man born in Hong Kong that ended up emigrating to San Francisco in order to find a better life with him and his sister. His sister kind of goes off, and gets into really bad, situations, and unfortunately she dies. Then he comes back to Hong Kong, and he's trying to reintegrate himself into this old culture, nominally because he's infiltrating it as part of his operation, but realistic, it's because he wants to reconnect with this culture. And you see that kind of division between those two worlds. It's more about than just, hey, I am really liking being with this gang of criminals that I happen to actually really like. No, it's about, I am getting in touch with my original culture. I am getting in touch with my childhood friends, and they matter to me. And it feels like trying to reintegrate yourself into that culture is almost like being undercover, because you can't really be that person anymore. And that's really the immigrant experience at core. You don't really fit either way, because to the other side, you're seen as a foreigner. And to them, you're seen as someone that is another. You're no longer part of us anymore, And I feel that Sleeping Dogs in particular does that so well. And there are some like storyline threads there that make me think that the developers were really trying to tap that nerve. Because, for example, I mean, there's this character that you can romance, and she's played actually by Emma Stone, Academy Award winner Emma Stone. And she's, an American girl that's, kind of backpacking through Hong Kong, or staying in Hong Kong. And you start kind of dating her, you start kind of going out, and then you find out that she's only into you because she has this Asian fetish, and it kind of speaks to this very real experience of like, are you seeing me as a person, or are you seeing me because, you like what I represent? So I feel like the developers, really had their finger on this nerve, and it's such a shame that this game didn't do better, because I think it's not only one of the best GTA likes, I think it's one of the best games of all time, to be quite frank. And a large part of that is because, some of the elements in the story are ridiculous, but there's an authenticity in characters and lived-in experiences there that I don't see very often, not only in games, in movies, in any type of media. So, big reason why I wanted to come here is play Sleeping Dogs. Really, you can get it for like $3 most of the time. So go play Sleeping Dogs. I haven't seen anybody that played Sleeping Dogs and said, yeah, it was okay. So anyways, I don't know if I went on a tangent there, but that's why I think Sleeping Dogs resonates so strongly with me.
Yeah, no, that's great stuff.
It is a very interesting spyglass into a culture that a lot of people maybe wouldn't understand or wouldn't see normally. It also kind of wears its criticism on its sleeve of the culture that it's surrounded by. Because I mean, not to like get into the real world politics of all things, but due to its location and in its recent, I would consider it recent in terms of how old Hong Kong is, but it's more recent rejoining to China in the 90s. There is pretty overt criticism of the government in that game. Most people could probably tell that the games that I tend to enjoy that do talk about other cultures tend to criticize either the government or the people who criticize the culture within those games.
I think Ozzy touched on something that I had kind of taken for granted, but something that is true about like the immigrant experience, and especially the experience of somebody who is from the place and then goes to another place, grows up in the other place, and then tries to come back. And that is something that, like, I spent a long time overseas living in Korea, but I did not have trouble integrating back into the US. But what I did notice is that the Koreans who, like, maybe they're born in Korea or maybe they were born in the US and then moved to Korea and try and integrate back, a lot of times they have a really hard time with that. And so the experience of the main character in Sleeping Dogs sounds like it's, you know, right along those lines, and something that I experienced kind of secondhand with people that I, you know, met and hung out with and learned their experience while living over there. So that's great to touch on here. And it's something that, like, when I played the game, I didn't key in on. Perhaps I should replay it and feature it on the podcast here. Now that I have a podcast where I can dedicate the time and focus on stuff like that.
Play Sleeping Dogs.
Yeah, play Sleeping Dogs.
I think Wario64 on Twitter posts every time it goes on sale. So just follow Wario. You'll know you'll get it for $2 and you'll have a good time.
Square Enix can't get rid of it fast enough. Square Enix was so disappointed with the sales that it's just giving it away all the time.
Oh, Square Enix being disappointed with sales. Name a better combination.
Yeah. Oh, our Final Fantasy game didn't sell bukus. I guess it was a flop, guys.
Right. Randall, what's another one that you brought?
So I guess I'll kind of combine two examples together because of how I wanted to incorporate them into this list. So I'll commend Dave and Ozzy for having actual, like, cultural examples that don't, like, kind of build off of fiction to use, I mean, it's kind of word salad, but use allegory to then talk about culture. Mm-hmm. But the two examples I want to bring up are This War of Mine and Suzerain. So This War of Mine is a survival strategy game. I guess you could call it a roguelike. I don't want to call it that. It's mostly just a survival strategy game. And Suzerain is a political, I would almost call it a political thriller strategy game. And I'll describe both games in tandem and then why I picked them for my list. So a lot of people probably know what This War of Mine is. If you don't, I almost want you to pause this, go find it on one of the bundles that they've probably put their game on for free, especially during the beginning of the Ukraine, I don't know what the politically correct way of talking about it, but I'll just say
Ukrainian war, man. I mean, just call it like it is.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say invasion. But anyways, they were actually giving that game away for people to play it to use as an example. So with that, go play it real quick and then come back to this. But This War of Mine is a perfect example built on the ramifications of global powers not understanding what things do to the small people at home. And Suzerain, it is showing what the local ramifications are for the decisions that global powers can make as well. So with This War of Mine, it takes place in a fictional city where a war has broken out. There is an invading army that is completely just destroying the city while there are hundreds of thousands of citizens still living in that city. You control either a small group of survivors or a small group of, like, a family, and it's the whole point is just to survive. You raid houses that may have other people living in them. You can try to barter, or you have to kill them. It's incredibly gut wrenching. And the main reason I wanted to bring This War of Mine up is not because of just what the game shows you. Since it takes place in a fictional city, it doesn't overtly tell you where it is, but the developers have pretty much come out and said, even though this game was made in 2014, the moment that Ukraine got invaded, they told people, please just go play this game. And this is going to be a 1-to-1, if not 1,000 times worse in real life. And they wanted people to understand this is how cultures are affected by it. And this will be a criticism. Western like globalism or imperialism spreading across the pond and then like invading Iraq or Iran, something like that, or Russia invading Ukraine. And it's just, it boils the culture down to a single person. And then it shows you, okay, what is one person left with it if everything around them has been destroyed? And so it's a huge, I feel like I'm just kind of talking in circles, but it's a big example on when a person is able to survive in that type of situation, that they bring with them a lot of their culture. And the game does show off a lot of kind moments where the characters will tell each other stories during downtime, and they use real world examples in these stories, whether it be from like World War II or something similar, Vietnam, stuff like that. And then I'll go ahead and shift to Suzerain, which is a strategy game, real quick, where you take place as a president of a fictional country called Swordland. It is an allegory for Yugoslavia. Pretty much the only thing that they didn't say was just calling it Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. And you take the role as the president. And your job is to just make sure that your country doesn't die. And you have to make decisions of your people coming to you about, do I work with the people to keep our history intact, to make sure, the people of Swordland understand, I'm here with them. I'm not trying to destroy our history. I'm not kowtowing to communism, capitalism, all that fun stuff. And it's an incredible case study on how people interact with other cultures that don't necessarily care what the other culture thinks about them and just want to kind of push it onto them. So both examples is just, oh, hey, I believe my way of living is right, so I don't care what you think. I'm just going to push it onto you. With Suzerain, it's more political, and it's, there isn't a lot of death. It's just stress with being a president. But with this War of Mine, it's the example of, oh, well, I don't like your culture, so I'm going to invade your country and kill all of your people. And both sets of developers have talked about how much the influence of places like Ukraine, Iraq, Yugoslavia have all worked into allowing them to make the game that they wanted to have real world examples, and just how deeply saddened that they had real world examples to point to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, and I've seen this War of Mine. I've got it in the bundle. I have it in my backlog, but I haven't been able to tell a tale from that particular segment of the backlog. As I feel, as I get older, and I have a 2-year-old daughter, I feel like it's harder and harder to see that kind of suffering. And this War of Mine is probably one of the best examples of how gut-wrenching, the world can be, even if it's told in a fictional country. I think the parallels are very clear, and they're kind of timeless, because it's really about war refugees. It's about, the victims of atrocious acts of violence. And the older I get, the harder it is for me to absorb that kind of media. Mm-hmm. Not only in media, but also, in real life. I've had to limit my intake of news, with the whole conflict in the Middle East, because it's just very harsh to kind of take all that suffering. And, I think I've done my part in knowing what's happening and being able to talk about what's happening, but it's very hard for me to experience that in video game form. Because I just don't necessarily want to go through that gut-wrenching emotional punch.
And this studio, specifically with this War of Mine, they deal in this specific like bleak type of game, because they also made Frostpunk, which is like one of the bleakest games I've ever played.
And I love it.
A possible future game on Tales from the Backlog, because now that I have a podcast to dig into it, there's a bunch of interesting stuff to talk about in Frostpunk. I also own this War of Mine and haven't played it yet, and just no great reason, probably except for kind of like you said, Ozzy, like I'm looking at my games on my Switch and I'm like, I could play this War of Mine or I could play Shovel Knight. Well,
Shovel Knight it is.
Yeah, but it is a game that I feel like I should play to get this kind of experience. This studio's from Poland, by the way, so even though they're not involved in a conflict right now, they certainly have their share of suffering in their past as well. So this is a great example, and Suzerain sounds interesting too from that kind of like management perspective. Like you have the two scopes, like you have the president all the way down to like the individual in this War of Mine. So those are good examples, and good examples of like, yeah, they're not like, they don't come out and say we're set in this specific real world place, but it is not hard to just put a real place on those games and imagine those as those real historical types of settings. So yeah, these are great examples.
Yeah, I guess to finally like hammer the point home with both of them, and to echo what you said, Dave, all it would take was for one of the developers to say, "Oh yeah, this is literally just set in X or Y," to get people to understand what the point that they're trying to make. With both of them, it, while not overtly cultural, the message that they try to send is try to understand the people that you're interacting with, or where they're coming from before you decide that it's not important, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, with this topic and the games that we're trying to highlight here, it's valuable to show people, like I set it up as showing culture and history, but it's also valuable to show real experiences that real people are having right now as we're recording this podcast. So these are definitely valuable games to shine the light on, for sure. Ozzy, what else do you have for this conversation here?
Well, I also kind of want to touch about, on Latin American, I guess, derived, stories or cultures. And the frustrating part that I find here is that a lot of the times it's just used for aesthetic purposes, but not really to explain a broader culture. So one of the most common recurring themes is the Mexican Day of the Dead. I mean, it's almost like a trope in and of itself, the Day of the Dead, really. I mean, it's kind of bland at this point because it's used so often. And you see Grim Fandango, being perhaps the most notable one. Definitely a much better game than StarCraft. Sorry, that's a King of Games joke.
Good God, man.
And yeah, I mean, Grim Fandango does that very well, but again, I mean, it's done by what used to be LucasArts, and Tim Schafer and so forth, and they're very respectful, and it's a very, very cool setting, and it really kind of echoes all this mythology of Day of the Dead, but doesn't really go much more beyond just, hey, this is cultural flavor. Or Guacamelee, which uses the Day of the Dead thematic as well as kind of the luchador type of Mexican thematic, but it's done by a Canadian studio, which again doesn't really care that much about kind of delving into the culture other than just again using it for aesthetic purposes. You have games like Tunche, which is a beat 'em up that is by Peruvian developers, and it actually takes place in kind of the Amazonian rainforest of sort. But again, I'm disappointed in that it doesn't really do anything with that culture other than just use it as flavor. Another game would be Dandara. Dandara is done by a Brazilian studio, and it kind of uses the Afro-American culture of Brazil to portray this warrior called Dandara that's actually based on a real-life figure that was a freed slave in Brazil that fought against her slave owners. But there, I mean, it's kind of a sci-fi tale, just using this kind of figure as inspiration. And again, it's kind of like a missed opportunity because there's so much to mine here. And in particular, what I wanted to kind of talk about is that there are some cultures that would really make for cool video games, even just beyond the cultural aspect. So, for example, the West African Yoruba religion, which is very integrated into Caribbean cultures because so many of the slaves came from that West African region, so Senegal, Nigeria, etc. They have their own mythology, which, you know, to the uninformed, you would call, for example, some of it Santeria, which is not the case. It's just, you know, kind of the manifestations of energy, etc., that this religion and this culture venerates. But it has this whole pantheon of gods, you know, that are, you know, that rival the Greek gods in terms of, you know, their interesting aspects and their dynamics and their conflicts and their drama, that could translate very well into a God of War like or a Souls like per se, and it's just not mined enough. It's just really not used enough. So it's kind of, you know, I'm kind of putting out an APB, you know, to developers. Just, hey, this is a pretty cool setting, you know. So rather than, you know, adapting Dante's Inferno, you know, a 14th century poem, you know, maybe, you know, adapt your God of War like through West African Yoruba religion. So that's just kind of what I wanted to talk about, you know, just the fact that so many times we see these cultures portrayed in just a flavor or aesthetic point of view, which I think there's some value in it because I want to see something other than just generic Western culture. But I do wish that they would go a little bit deeper than that. And like I said, there are just some settings that are very, very cool that, you know, some of them I am even missing because I just don't know about them. So, you know, again, just pick up a book about different cultures and maybe use that for your next settings, your developers.
Yeah, this is one of those things where, like, I think as game development tools keep getting more accessible and widely distributed and hope more people get access to those tools, we should start to see more games about that. Now, the problem is finding them a lot of the time because there are so many games that come out on Steam and so many, like infinitely more that come out on itch every single day, that finding those games can be really tough. But I think that, like, the fact that those tools are becoming more widespread gives more people an opportunity to kind of tell their story. And I think that's great. And hopefully we'll have better representation than Guacamelee and stuff like that. I heard that criticism about Guacamelee and I didn't get far enough in that game. And I don't know enough about that tradition to, like, have that criticism or respond to that criticism myself. But I have heard that other places too.
And I am not Mexican, but I am Latin, and so we share a lot of the same culture. And the thing that I can say about Guacamelee, it's a pretty cute game, you know, and I think mechanically it's very good. But within like 5 minutes of playing it, you can tell, oh, this wasn't made by you know, natives. This wasn't made by an authentic group of folks. And that's where I kind of go at it again. Like, it's not an issue of cultural appropriation. It's an issue of, like, if you're going to use this, you should do it in a way that if someone who is a native or who knows well about that culture doesn't feel like, oh, you just kind of slap things on, you know, without really taking the time to represent it in an authentic way. And you can really tell from the first 5 minutes that that's the case. That you could tell that this was made by people that were not from that area. And that they did not, in particular, compared to like Never Alone or the other games we've talked about, they were not made on consultation with people, you know, that do have that lived-in knowledge. I will say one game that is forgotten by history and time, and that it's actually from my childhood.
Okay.
And you can actually probably remember it because it was a demo on Gex 3. So there was a demo of it on Gex, and it was done by Crystal Dynamics, who are now better known for the Tomb Raider games. It's called Akuji the Heartless.
Okay.
And Akuji is based on voodoo mythology and voodoo culture, so like Haitian voodoo culture. And the cool thing about Akuji, it's not a very good game, but the cool thing is that it really buys into that culture. It's not taking into account any kind of, Western side of it. It's just like, yeah, it's fully immersed in Haitian voodoo culture. Whether it's accurate or not, I can't tell you, but it did just submerge itself completely and freely into this particular culture to build this universe. So cool kind of, historical tidbit. You could probably find the game nowadays for like $12. It's actually on PSN if you want to get it, on the PS3, PS1 Classic, if you were interested in that. So if you want to see the game that Crystal Dynamics made between Gex and Soul Reaver, this is it.
Cool. Yeah, I like the idea of kind of not watering the culture down for the audience, just being 100% into it, for sure. Would you guys say we go lightning round style through some other stuff we want to mention before getting into our community submissions for this episode?
Yeah, man. Sure.
Sounds good.
All right. I will just briefly shout out a game that I have not played, but I do know enough about it to bring it up on the show, and that's Kingdom Come Deliverance, which is by Warhorse Studios. They are from the Czech Republic, and this is set in historical Bohemia, which is the region that later became the Czech Republic. Kingdom Come Deliverance is an RPG. If you look at screenshots, it looks a lot like a Skyrim type game, but it is fully based in the history and realism of your, like when your character starts, you can't fight. You're a piece of shit. It's one of those where it's like you have to learn. I think you even have to learn to read in that game. Like you have to eat and drink, that kind of realism. And I think they went. I've read praise for them for going the distance as far as like doing their best to recreate an era in real history. Now, you may be acting out an unrealistic story in there. I don't know. I haven't played it. That game's like 100 fucking hours long, but it is a really cool game. I just wanted to shout it out. Kingdom Come Deliverance.
And by the way, made from some of the original developers of the original Mafia game, which Randall mentioned. So they did that after breaking off from 2K Czech, which used to be Illusion Softworks.
Nice.
So they were one of the original indie developers in the Czech Republic, and so they branched out into India and they did a not a GoFundMe. What do you call that?
A Kickstarter?
A Kickstarter for that game, and it was sold as Skyrim or Oblivion without fantasy.
Right.
So I really appreciated that.
Yeah, and I think that game, when it first came out, was like a kind of broken, buggy mess, and they've really fixed it up. As far as I know, it works now. So if you're interested in that, you can go play it.
I guess I'll go ahead and do my lightning round real quick. Unless you wanted, did you have any more, Dave?
Nope.
Cool. Yeah. The only other one that I had on my list, at least in the forefront of my mind, was Metro 2033. Pretty much any of the Metro games, except I guess I would really not say the last one, because that one kind of jumps the shark in terms of the sci-fi elements and the fantasy stuff. But the first game bleeds Russian culture, not just like post Soviet era culture. It's the whole thing is as Russian as you could get. The whole game takes place in the Moscow metro, which is one of, if I'm not mistaken, it's one of the oldest like series of metro tunnels in the world, and it's literally how the country functions. So a lot of the history and the stories told in the game while in that metro is so deeply seated in how it was built and how the people use it. It's incredibly impressive. And then also there are plenty of political themes and faction conflicts in the game, that how the Russian people were like against the Germans and everything in World War II. It's all really great. And Metro 2033 was my other.
Randall, I think I can surmise that you like Eastern Slavic cultures, about people fighting back against repression. I don't know. I mean, this is just a wild guess here, but it seems like you may be into that particular theme.
Oh, totally not. Yeah, no, this is just a coincidence. This isn't like some of my favorite parts of history that surprisingly nobody actually fucking talks about. Like when people talk about World War II, it's always about, the Americans came in after Pearl Harbor got bombed. It's like, yeah, but are we going to talk about Stalingrad? Are we going to talk about how that's probably one of...
Call of Duty had the original Stalingrad level. You know, that Call of Duty, the one that we love to hate, it had the Stalingrad level in the very first game. So
that is still one of the best scenes in Call of Duty history. I swear to God. And it's so visceral. I don't want to get into it too much, but anyways, Eastern European culture normally doesn't get talked about all that much unless it's in a negative context, unfortunately. Or I can understand why. Don't get me wrong, especially with some of the stuff that I've already talked about on this podcast. But listen, the history of the Slavic people or Eastern European people, it's incredible what these guys put up with over the past 100, 200 years alone.
Mm-hmm.
I guess on my side, lightning round, I don't know how many picks I get. So Dave, let me know. I will say first one, Kowloon's Gate. Very, 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 very fucking obscure PS1 game. Never came out in the United States. But similar to what we have talked about, it takes place on 1997 in the eve of the handover, from from England, from Great Britain. And it takes place in the Kowloon walled city.
Ooh.
That re-emerges after it demolished. And so it takes place literally within the walled city. And it uses all this influence of Feng Shui, and all these different kind of religious motifs of yin and yang and Buddhism, etc., to tell this completely batshit story that I can't tell you about because the game has not been fan translated. So I'm sorry, I'm giving you a game that you cannot play. Or you can play, but you're only going to get 25% of it. But my call here, please translate this game. I want to play this game. Please do it.
It's
because it seems so freaking cool. Just real quick, another one, Mark of Kree. Mark of Kree is a forgotten PS2 game done by Sony Studios San Diego, which are now just exclusively doing MLB The Show games. But before they were put on MLB The Show duty, they did this game, which was a mixture of traditional hand-drawn 2D Disney animation and Polynesian culture. And let me tell you, this game is one of the best out there. It goes for $7 or $8, physical on PS2. And it has a sequel, Rise of the Kasai. Go play it. It's a really, really cool game. It has great animation. It has great art style. And it's basically taking place all in Polynesian culture. So really, really cool. I would say go out and play it.
Awesome. Yeah, those sound cool. Especially the Kowloon walled city is one of my favorite settings in fiction. I would love to shout out a Shadowrun Hong Kong, but there's almost no. You're not going to learn anything from playing that game. It's just a fantasy cyberpunk game. It's awesome, but you're not going to learn anything. But yeah, those are great picks. We are going to listen to a little bit of music, and when we come back, we've got some submissions from the community from our Discord server. All right, we're back, and we're going to bring in some submissions from our community, from the Discord server. If you would like to take part in episodes like this and have your thoughts be a part of the show, you can join the Discord server. There's a link down in the show notes. On top of, being a part of the show from time to time, we also have a thriving and active community in there talking about video games and movies and life and stuff like that. We would love to have you. It's a wonderful group of people. Again, there's an invite link down in the show notes. Without further ado, let's get started with the first submission. This is from Jake, who is a patron of the show, from the Pre-Order Bonus podcast, a wonderful podcast, highly recommended. Jake shouted out Mulaka, which is from Lienzo Studios, which is a 3D action-adventure game made by a Mexican studio in conjunction with the Tarahumara people, sorry about my pronunciation, Jake, of northern Mexico, about their culture and mythology. Jake's actually a professor of, I believe, Latin American literature or something like that. So Jake's got the hookup for stuff like this. This sounds really cool. Ozzy, you were kind of lamenting the lack of games that kind of go deep into the culture and stuff like that. But it sounds like we found one from Mexico.
Well, this is. I mean, I'm looking at it and I'm like, this is exactly what I need. This is exactly what I was looking for. And from what I'm looking at it here, it seems to be kind of a Zelda-like, kind of a 3D Zelda-like or a Kami-like, if you will. So I'm really curious about it. It seems to only be going for $20 on the Switch. So I might actually go and dig into it. I mean, it's not that it may necessarily do something in terms of mechanics that is vastly different, but sometimes all it takes is just doing, taking that template from, another more successful video game and building something with authenticity, to really make you stand out.
Right.
I don't put as much of a premium as reviewers do in innovation, because we've seen how much that backfires. Back in the 2D to 3D transition, everyone was praising 3D and putting down any 2D games. And so, again, because reviewers are constantly looking for new experiences, I feel like part of it is that reviewers review so many games that they're just looking for something different, and they're just kind of trying to find something that stands out. And again, I mean, I feel like with these games, I'm fine with doing something that's been done before if you're able to capture something in a very authentic and real way and give me something that I haven't experienced before.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess we'll go on to the next one, because I don't really have anything to add other than maybe Jake should just start dropping some like Latin American or just Latin knowledge, like in the Discord. I would like to learn more about that type of stuff. It's certainly a culture that I'm not super familiar with. But yeah, so the other mentions, so we got Chris C., a patron from the Retro Hangover podcast, also a good friend. He mentioned Dynasty Warriors, which whenever he posted this, I immediately went, "Are you sure?" And everybody immediately went, "Randall, shut up. This is definitely historical. I don't know what the hell you're talking about." And I was like, you know what?
Historical in air quotes.
Yeah. I mean, from what I remember, the early Dynasty Warrior games actually did, like, there were cutscenes that talked about like the actual conflicts that these generals and political figures had. And then it just turns into a Musu game where you just blow people up with your spinning pikes and shit. And he also mentioned Romance of the Three Kingdoms series. Roughly the same vibe, but it's like a completely different style of game, I guess.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Dynasty Warriors being about, your fantasy spinning kick. I mean, they both take the same setting, which is basically the Three Kingdoms era, which was towards the end of the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century in China. And they do different things with it. So the Musou games, the Dynasty Warriors games, are very much fantasy-oriented, but also fantasy-oriented in the sense that this is kind of in the traditional style of wuxia epics for Chinese cinema. Wuxia being so important to them, where, even the historical epics have some element of fantasy to them. So I think Dynasty Warriors is still very much, even though we may, laugh at it, but it's still very much, even though it's done by Koei Tecmo, which is Japanese, I do feel like it still respects that kind of original, cultural, sense of this is how we present our stories. And it's all based on the original, Romance of the Three Kingdoms novels, which was written by Luo Guanzhong. And Romance of the Three Kingdoms, instead, it's basically a civilization type game. Really kind of manufacturing this Three Kingdoms period in a more realistic setting. And so it kind of really gives you a lot more flavor of what was at stake here, between the states, that were at war. And you get to take part in it, which I think, the very best historical games tend to do that, like Europa Universalis or Crusader Kings, etc. They really put you into this time and place, and are able to make you feel like you're making decisions, based on the stakes that applied at the time. So I do feel, like Chris Coplin actually, was not out of line here.
We just like to give Chris shit sometimes.
100%. And to kind of build off of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms thing, I'll just mention Total War Three Kingdoms. Talk about historical accuracy, like that the game literally has like actual historical texts within the game that you're supposed to read to understand how to play these armies that you're controlling and these cities that you're building.
Except I think it does have magic in it, Randall.
No. If you're letting Dynasty Warriors fly, we're letting Total War fly.
It's not exactly Total War, medieval or Total War Rome. They've ever since they started doing the Warhammer games, I mean, that's when they said, okay, maybe we can just add a few fireballs in here.
No. And then Chris's last little plug here was Assassin's Creed 1, which was set in Israel, Palestine, Syria. I guess this just kind of opens Pandora's box with talking about Assassin's Creed. We've kind of avoided it the entire time, but so Assassin's Creed.
Just want to shout out, this was also submitted by Parallax Puddles, so we don't want to skip you later, Puddles. Appreciate you writing in. Puddles also wrote in other Assassin's Creed games as well. So yeah, let's just open the Assassin's Creed box.
Yeah, I mean, because this is one of the games that I originally had on my list, and I had just kind of slotted them into the big franchises doing, cultural things in a way. And I feel like Ubisoft is probably the best at doing this in terms of they're the ones that kind of go to that well more often than not. And you can go back to the Prince of Persia games. The Prince of Persia games, even though they're still very fantastical and they're still seen through a Western lens, I mean, it does still kind of portray this period, or at least this mythology that is not very often portrayed. I mean, not like Aladdin or anything like that, probably, something where it's, taking place in Persia, modern day Iran, and that kind of through line, that kind of lineage is seen in the Assassin's Creed games, and in particular the first game, which is what Chris mentioned. The very strong element that I was drawn to with the original Assassin's Creed, I was just completely enthralled by the possibility of Assassin's Creed, and when it was announced, I was over the moon. It was actually one of the first games that I got for the 360, and it was exactly what I wanted, which is that it gave me this very particular setting, Crusader era Middle East, and it tried to recreate these cities that still may exist, like Damascus, but they're not, really how they used to look like anymore. And it just kind of puts you in that time and place. And I think the very best Assassin's Creed games managed to do that. And in particular, I'm thinking about Origins. I think Origins is probably the best example of doing, this kind of cultural slice of life well. Not only because it manages to replicate that whole Egyptian era very authentically. I mean, I didn't live there. I wasn't, born at that time, but what I could muster is very authentic. But it also takes the extra step of giving you this optional, features where you can actually see a tutorial of a documentary of different knowledge about all the different recreations, of this world that they built. So you can, read about the burial practices, and how they built the pyramids and how they would build the tombs, etc. And, the funny thing is that I played Origins when I was living in New York, and then I went to the museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has a huge Egyptian component and wing. And I was just thinking, oh yeah, I read about that in Assassin's Creed Origins, or I read about this, or this is this, or this is that. I think that the very best Assassin's Creed games do that. And what is so exciting about Assassin's Creed games, even though, they've kind of lost their luster, is thinking, where are they going to set the world now? Because I want them to recreate that world. I want to be able to walk the streets of Damascus in the 12th century. It's so rare to find that experience that I think this is where video games shine. And I wish that Assassin's Creed didn't go so batshit crazy with its futuristic storyline and the way that they change, gameplay like they change pants. But I think in the very best cases, Assassin's Creed is able to put you in a time and place in a very, what you would feel would be authentic way.
Yeah, I agree. I think that like the best thing that Assassin's Creed did for me, especially like the first one and kind of with Black Flag, set in the Caribbean and stuff. I didn't play Origins, but the best thing that the Assassin's Creed games did for me was give me curiosity to go then learn more about that history on my own. Because when I was making my list, I didn't really consider Assassin's Creed because maybe it was because of the lack of commitment to the historical setting. I always felt like in those older games, especially, that just when you feel like you're getting into it, they pull you out for like the future storyline with Desmond. And I hated that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Throughout the entire series, every game I played, I always groaned when we got pulled into the future timeline. So I wish they would have committed more to giving you that old time and place. But it did inspire me to go learn a little bit about those places on my own, which I will give it credit for.
But I don't think that the authenticity necessarily is an issue, Dave. I think that the authenticity is there. They have historians, they have consultants that they work on. They try to replicate the cities based on old maps of the city, etc. The problem is that it's constantly undermined by this Batchet story,
right?
And the futuristic part.
I wasn't questioning like the authenticity of the spaces that they created. It's just like, I wish they would have committed to that and only that. I don't want to be pulled out of that for like this weird future storyline that they're trying to tell every couple hours. That's the issue.
Trust me, I lament it every day. Every single time I look at Assassin's Creed, I think to myself, why the hell can't you guys just not do something with this future storyline and just kind of do a historical epic?
They heard the criticism the entire time since like 2008, something like that. They heard seven. The entire time they heard that criticism, and the entire time they doubled down on that shit.
Guys,
pretty much.
Assassin's Creed is 16 years old.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Yeah, don't get me started. But one point that I'll also give Assassin's Creed 1 credit for is it takes place in a place that was incredibly controversial at the time, and only seen in a negative light. And and to give Ubisoft all the credit in the world, they took a place that a lot of folks, especially in the Western world, hated for a lot of reasons, and they showed how beautiful the culture could be from a different perspective of somebody who lived there, who breathed there. And it was just, I found it extremely impressive when I was a kid, because, I grew up around people who only, like, my mom didn't even want me to buy the game because of where she knew where it took place. It was that bad.
Real quick, before we get off of Assassin's Creed, Ozzy, is what you were mentioning, is that the museum mode where you can...
Yeah, the museum mode.
Okay.
Yeah,
a couple other people in the Discord server shouted that out, specifically Desba, and then in parentheses, the other Adam. So shout out Adam/Desba for shouting out the museum mode of Origins and Odyssey. Assassin's Creed, we'll allow it. Yeah.
Yeah. That was definitely a lightning round.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think we had to talk about Assassin's Creed a little bit in this. They are the most famous franchise doing these real world locations.
Right.
Yeah. And okay, so I have here from Alex from the First 5 YouTube channel. He mentions Venba, and he also mentions Raji, an ancient epic, which incidentally was also mentioned by This Chimera. So thank you, This Chimera.
Right.
And both of them are dealing with Indian culture. He also mentions the Metro series, Necro Barista, which he says has a lot of fantasy, but also a lot of Australia. Haven't played it. And then the historical strategy games, which we have discussed in some capacity: Europa Universalis, Crusader Kings, and Total War 3 Kingdoms. So those are pretty cool. I thought about Raji, an ancient epic, and I feel like that definitely is in the wheelhouse of what we were talking about. I just didn't know enough about it, to be able to speak to it. But I do remember that it was put together, I think, in one of the Xbox showcases, if I recall correctly, for Game Pass, and I think a big selling point of it was just this is taking place in very much within this Indian tradition. So it's very cool that, it seems like some people, really found that to be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the selling points for Raji in particular was, again, it's made by people making a game about their own culture and stuff, which is great. And when it came out, I feel like there were tons of people that were like, finally, someone made a game about this.
Yeah.
And I'll just put a small point on the Necrobarista thing. It is a lot of fantasy and a lot of Australia. It takes place in Melbourne, and just how incredibly hipster Melbourne is, and how absolutely addicted to coffee. That whole situation is, and also talking about like the native. I think voodoo would be the incorrect, like, what's a comparison? But it's like there is a real significance for like the native folk and like necromancy and stuff like that. So that the fantastical elements are still seated deep within Australia's history, but Necrobarista is also a really good time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we talk about a game that's, I like the description, very fantasy, but also very Australian. Talking with our Australian friends and, the podcast community and the Discord server and stuff, not many games set in Australia. Even the Australians are like, I don't fucking know. So I wanted to shout out an upcoming game that looks cool. I don't know how steeped in Australian culture it's going to be, but it's called Broken Roads, which is a Disco Elysium Fallout style game set in like post-apocalyptic Australia. That sounds cool, and apparently there are just not enough games set in Australia for, as, I don't know, I feel like Australia, at least in like my upbringing, like Australian humor and influence and stuff is bigger than like its impact on like, games set there and media set there seems to be. So I'm glad that like we might have one coming out. I hope that came out right. I'm not trying to diminish Australia. I love you all, but it was surprising to me where I was like, yeah, any Australians know of a game set in Australia that we can mention? They're like, nope, don't know. So
yeah. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, however you want to take the point, but a lot of games that do take place in Australia tend to be about like wildlife conservatism, like zoo management systems, stuff like that, just because of how deeply tied Australia is to conserving the wildlife that it does have.
I was going to say, based on how fucking wild the wildlife is there.
Correct, but like a lot of the games that are based in Australia, like they don't overtly say it, but whenever you play them, you're like, oh yeah, this is extremely Australian, but it's a management game about taking care of animals.
Gotcha.
Shout out to KO the kangaroo.
Yeah,
there you go.
And Ty the Tasmanian tiger.
We've got another submission here from Nomad from the Retro Wildlands podcast. What's up, Nomad? Nomad shouts out Spec Ops: The Line, which is set in Dubai. And when Nomad sent this, I was like, I don't know, but we'll hear him out. It says he had never really seen the scope of Dubai before playing the game, kind of focusing on ultra-modern architecture and hinting at some of the social divides within the city, even after, in that game, Dubai is swallowed by like an apocalyptic sandstorm. So like reading that description, I'm like, yes, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like the scope of like just those buildings and, like you said, the social divide there and stuff. I'll allow it, Nomad. You're okay.
I won't, Dave.
Okay.
No, I feel like, look, I mean, this is a retelling of Apocalypse Now, and I feel like really, that story is really about colonialism, and kind of transposed to American, I guess, war on terror times, applicable to the Middle East. So in a way, it's kind of the quintessential criticism of Western encroachment. So in a way, yes, I mean it's a critique of Western, mores, being pushed on these people, who have no choice. But I don't think, it really does a lot with, the culture in Dubai, other than just having, cannon fodder for your character. Which again,
Not
I mean,
from
it turns back, the story on, the subversive element of, maybe you really are the bad guy. But I don't think necessarily it goes into, what these people are going through necessarily.
Not from that aspect, no, but just from the pure scope of like, maybe you heard about Dubai and then you play a game that's set there and you're like, wow, okay, I see how big these places are. Like that simple aspect of it. And you do get a little bit later of like how people are suffering in that game, but it's because of stuff that you're doing. So.
You're inflicting the suffering.
I would say it's a complete opposite, but also a friend of this war of mine in that aspect, because instead of playing the survivor, you are in fact playing the problem.
Yeah. Shout out real quick to the episode of Tales from the Backlog I did about Spec Ops: The Line with our mutual friend Chris Copleen from Retro Hangover. One of my favorite spoiler section discussions that we've had on the show. So I'll just shout that out.
That game, honestly, that's one of those games like, I guess this War of Mine, where it was just grueling to play. And it got to a point where I was just like, all right, I'm going to have to force myself to finish this game. But, it is what it is. But I get where Nomad is coming from, and I admire it. I don't agree with it necessarily, but I'll accept that argument.
And then, so we have another submission here, and this is from Chris, aka Vertigo to Hell, also Vertigo to Hell on Twitch. So please drop a follow there. They mentioned Home Sweet Home, a horror game set in Thailand and is loaded with spooky Thai folklore that they never knew about. I actually think somebody on the Retro Hangover podcast just got finished streaming Home Sweet Home. So. Double plug, you could probably go watch two different types of reactions to these games. I don't know if Vertigo to Hell streamed it at all, but if they didn't, this is now the calling card to go do so. And then they also mentioned Detention and Devotion, which we talked about at the beginning. They also mentioned Kingdom Come Deliverance. So they seem to like a lot of the same games that you do, Dave.
I do know that Chris did stream, like, I don't know if he finished the playthrough of Kingdom Come Deliverance, but he streamed a lot of it. So if you want to go check out what that game is like, you can go watch some of Chris's videos, assuming he has them saved somewhere. And then, I would guess that he also streamed Home Sweet Home. That game looked pretty bad from what I watched on the stream that Retro Hangover was doing, but giving you the Thai folklore is cool. Thailand is a setting you never get in video games.
Never.
Well, I've seen the game pop up on sales and the like, and I always find like, okay, well, this is maybe one of those filler games that pop up on the eShop or the PlayStation Network. So now I'm a little bit more intrigued. So if I find it for a decent price, I might pick it up and see what it's about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that is all the submissions that we have for this topic. I appreciate everybody who wrote in. Again, if you want to be a part of these, all you need to do is join the Discord server, and I will put out the call every now and then for your submissions for these types of discussion type episodes. That is all we've got. So we just got a little bit of housekeeping to clean up here at the end. Ozzy and Randall, do you guys have anything that you want to plug? Anywhere that people can find you?
Well, you can find me on usually the Retro Hangover podcast Discord. That's kind of where I kind of relegate my internet presence to nowadays. And I'm there running the Retro Hangover review crew, the hallmark of which continues to be our discussion on Disco Elysium. So you don't know what you're missing out if you didn't take part in the great battle of Disco Elysium of January 2023. You were forced to take a side. So if you want to be part of that, anybody can join. We just play a game every month and we talk about it basically. And we get to nominate games for the next month. So it's just a good opportunity to just kind of all collectively play a game, kind of like a book of the month type thing, but game of the month. So you can usually find me there, and we'd love to have more participating.
Mm-hmm. You can find me in a bunch of different Discords from local podcasters that have been on the tube before. That is your that is the official title you use, right, Dave? The Tube.
Yes, yeah, the Tube, yeah.
Yeah. So I do hang out in Dave's Discord. I hang out in the Retro Hangover Podcast Discord, the Good, the Bad, and the Backlog, Pixel Project Radio. I'm in all of those. I don't have anything into the plug other than those podcasts that I just mentioned. You should go follow them. You should go listen to them if you haven't already. Obviously, I love Dave, and thank you for allowing me to be here. And I'll also double plug the like Retro Hangover Review Crew thing. I will admit some of the games that get picked. If we had more people participating, we could have better picks. This month's was especially difficult. I did vote for the pick, but man, it was rough to get through for personal reasons. But please come join us and vote on games, play the games, write a review. That'd be super awesome to have more participation in that.
Yeah, and we embrace democracy in the Retro Hangover Review Crew. So if a game gets picked, you have no one to blame but yourselves. So that's all right. I will say.
Yep. Yeah, it is a good time. So I'll go ahead and third that plug. That's not a real thing that people say. I will support that plug to join the Retro Hangover Discord, join the Retro Hangover Review Crew. Yeah, the Game of the Month Club over there. You can also join the High Score Challenge if you're into high score challenges over there too. Enough plugging Retro Hangover. Let me talk about myself for a little bit here.
Yeah.
I already gave the plug to join my Discord server, but I also have some other stuff that's really helpful, such as going on your favorite podcast app and leaving a rating and review. So if in the odd situation that someone went into their search bar and typed in games with real world settings, not the United States and Japan, that would help juice the algorithm in my favor. That would be great. But also, if someone goes in and types in Dead Space, it'll help them find this podcast. So ratings and reviews are super helpful. If you want to support monetarily, you can do so at patreon.com/RealDaveJackson. And all patron supporters get to vote in polls for what games I do on the show. There are bonus episodes, including, I forgot to mention this before, I talked about detention at the top of the show. In October, I did a bonus episode about detention. That's just solo Dave talking about detention. So
it was really good. It was really good.
Thank you. Go ahead and go to patreon.com/RealDaveJackson if that sounds good to you. So, Ozzy, Randall, thank you guys for coming on the show. This has been fantastic. This is exactly what I had in mind. I appreciate you guys.
Oh, thank you, Dave, for putting it together.
You.
So, stay tuned next week. I think, let me think about what's going on. Oh, first week of December is coming up. So we've got some cool games on the horizon. We've got Sea of Stars coming up. We've got Final Fantasy X and Blasphemous 2. Those are the games in December. So thank you all for listening. I appreciate you as always. Tune in next week for the next game to come out of the backlog.